The Cysteine ilex system is a device designed to treat patients with Meibomian Gland Dysfunction, or MGD. It is the leading cause of dry eye. Dry eye is caused by deficiencies in the quantity and quality of meibum or other tear components within the tear film. Around 30 million people are estimated in the United States to suffer from dry eye symptoms. According to a study, 86% of dry eye sufferers are reported to have clinical signs of Meibomian gland dysfunction. Healthy Meibomian glands produce clear and liquid meibum. Dysfunctional glands produce meibum that is either cloudy or thick and paste-like. In some cases, the glands do not express any meibum when compressed. This may indicate fully blocked, capped, or damaged glands. The Cysteine ilex system allows eye care professionals to target dysfunctional glands and improve signs and symptoms of MGD using localized heat followed by compression therapy. To clear the glands, the eye care professional positions the Cysteine ilex device on the eyelid and applies light-based heat to melt the meibum. Compression of the lids after heat therapy allows the eye care professional to express the unhealthy meibum. When the blockage is cleared from the unhealthy glands and/or clear, healthy meibum is seen on the lid margin. The procedure is complete.
Welcome to the Ocular Service Academy podcast, TFOS DEWS 2 edition. Join us as we meet with the researchers behind this epic international consensus. Each episode will feature practical clinical takeaways. Here's your host, Dr. Scott Schachter, and co-host Dr. Christopher Starr.
Welcome, everybody, to the inaugural episode of the overview of TFOS DEWS 2. We are joined by the creator and royalty of TFOS, Dr. David Sullivan. I've got Chris Starr co-moderating with me today to pick up where I don't know what I'm talking about, and Chris can jump in and help me. So, David, welcome, and thank you so much. We really appreciate this. We're going to be running through approximately 20 episodes, going through each subcommittee. And the purpose of this podcast is really translational medicine. The whole idea of this, I'll tell you how I got the idea to put this out, was when I was at the TFOS congressional briefing in July. I got a chance to meet with Dr. Essen Akpeck from Johns Hopkins, who told me this amazing story about her research on Sjogren's and found that she could take slit lamp findings, so corneal staining, and equate that into quality of life issues. And if you have corneal staining, you read about 28 words per minute slower over 30 minutes of sustained gaze. And I thought, wow, that we've talked about quality of life issues for years, but to me that was so specific. And now I have this real compelling reason. You know, I've talked to doctors for years, as you have as well, about why we should care about dry eye disease, why we should address it in our practices. It doesn't necessarily have a lot of morbidity, but it really affects quality of life. And I thought, I've not really heard of Dr. Akpeck very much, because the reason is she's so busy doing research, she doesn't have time to go out and talk about it. So I really wanted to get to know the scientists and ultimately behind this consensus, which has really become sort of the Bible of dry eye disease, TFOS DEWS 2, this massive undertaking from 2017 that I hear cited all the time. I've been reading through the subcommittees and have always come across something new that I think, oh my gosh. So we want to take those findings and get them out to the ODs and MDs across the country and the world for that matter, because we're going to be talking to international researchers that there is a lot of dry disease. It does affect quality of life, and there is a way to approach it systematically based on this expert consensus. So welcome to both of you, and thank you. And Dr. Sullivan, I'm not going to jump into your 62-page CV just yet. Very impressive. I know you are probably one of the most educated and published researchers in dry eye disease in the world. So share with us what got you to where you are today. What we want to do is go all the way through to, again, the origins of TFOS, all the way up to DEWS 2. But tell us a little bit about your career.
Sure. I got an undergraduate degree from Boston University. I got a master's degree from the University of Minnesota Medical School. I got my PhD at Dartmouth Medical School. When I was at University of Minnesota, getting that master's degree, just as an aside, I've been offered a scholarship to stay on for a PhD, but my wife said, no, we're not going to stay in Minnesota. The tornadoes here really bothered her. So we need to go somewhere else. So I applied to 3 schools. I applied to University of California, San Francisco. I applied to Harvard Medical School, and I applied to Dartmouth Medical School. University of California, San Francisco never responded. Harvard said yes next year. Dartmouth offered me a scholarship. Off to Dartmouth Medical School I went. While I was there as a graduate student, one of my mentors named Alan Monk, who is a world leader in the whole area of the immune system and corticosteroids, had a meeting in Bermuda behind a moon gate. He invited 25 of the world's leading researchers throughout the world. I wasn't invited. I was never invited to go anywhere as a graduate student. But I thought, wow, what an amazing thing to bring these leaders to a place to discuss at length about a topic of interest, in this case, corticosteroids and how they work. I thought if I ever become a faculty member, I would like to bring together, researchers and clinicians and also people from industry together, perhaps behind a moon gate, to discuss these kinds of issues, whatever they may be. So fast forward, I was recruited in as a postdoctoral fellow down at Harvard at Schepens Eye Research Institute. And once there, since I tend to go out and meet everybody and start talking to them, I went to ARVO meetings, immediately connected with people, and got together with a group called the Lacrimal Gland Tear Film Group, which was 5 or 6 people. And we had meetings every year, and I said, wouldn't it be a good idea to have a meeting in Bermuda behind a moon gate?
You're going to have to tell us what's a moon gate. Are you getting to that?
So yeah, I'm going to do that. So originally I said, wouldn't it be a good idea to have a meeting for people around the world who are working on the tear film and ocular surface? And one of them said, sure, why don't we have it in St. Louis near the Arch? Another one said, well, why don't we have it in North Carolina? Because I know a company that might contribute a few $100s. I said, what, I think we really need to do it behind a moon gate. Because when I was that graduate student, I thought, wow, it would be really something to do. But it turned out that meeting that I then organized with the input of over 100 different people and lost a lot of money. But whatever the case, it brought in close to 200 participants. And we have the meetings from 8 in the morning till 10 o'clock at night. And people said, please, if you're going to do this again, why don't you just do it at Chicago's O'Hare Airport, put a poster on the wall and say, hey, we're in Bermuda. And I said, well, if you want to go see Bermuda, come early, stay late, but we're having this meeting. So when I actually did a survey to see if people wanted to do this again, they said, yes, but let's please end the meeting earlier. So we stopped at around 6:30. So anyway, those conferences started. It was trying to get people from around the world who had different backgrounds, diverse backgrounds, who were researchers, clinicians, and also industry representatives together in one location. And the original idea was, 1, to create that global community, but 2, or to continue to build on it, but 2, also create a volume. And that was the first book we wrote, which was 700 pages related to these presentations. At the time, I should also note that when I was at ARVO, you might have 5 or 6 or 7 posters in a row related to this area, but there really wasn't a whole lot of research done on the tear film. There was a lot on the cornea, some on the conjunctiva, but that was it. And so it was an attempt to try to bring together these people and involving a number of other people in this effort to do that. So that's the origins of thinking about these conferences.
I'm curious, David.
Yep.
I'm just curious when it started back then. I mean, now the field of ocular surface disease and dry eye is a hot commodity. Everybody's kind of interested in it, from industry to optometry to ophthalmology. Back then, when there was and there's still to this day with some of the older clinicians, there is this kind of stigma around dry eye. Like, I don't want to, I don't want to deal with that. It's boring. It's not sexy. Whatever the terminology is. And back then, before prescription medications like immunomodulators and before the field, it really kind of evolved. How much interest was there amongst, I mean, certainly in research and immunology, it makes sense, but amongst clinicians, what was the interest level when you said, I'm putting together a dry eye meeting?
So back then when I started, when I was recruited in 82 to down at Schepens and Harvard, for dry eye disease, there had been no epidemiologic study. At the time, it thought that it was primarily a lacrimal gland problem, not enough water, and Sjogren's syndrome was the prototypical example of that. It was thought that there was no role at all for Meibomian gland or lipids. They didn't really play a role. And there was no real role either at the time, or so thought, for anti-inflammatories. and the treatment of dry eye disease. But getting involved in it, and getting involved in meeting a number of people, when we started to have the Lacrimal Gland and this tear film group, been involved about six or seven people. There were Britt Bromberg, Darlene Dart, there's someone named Austin Murchev. We brought in Coswit Sabota and a few others, Paul Montgomery. We would get together at the Sheraton, which was on Lido Key in Sarasota, to have a lunch. Britt we named as sort of the chair of the group, and I was the person responsible for getting people to come. So I would canvass the whole of Arvo and going up to people and recruiting them, and it bothered Britt because he'd have to keep the money in his pocket, and his pockets weren't large enough to keep the money. So every year we kept growing that, and that was the early 80s. And then it was in the middle 80s where I said, hey, can we do this? Because in the meantime, we got a number of people from around the world who were now expressing interest. So we had that meeting, and we did the next one in 96, and then we had about 230 people attend. They wanted to do it again in Bermuda. When we did the next one, it was because the Japanese wanted to have one near Maui, so we did it in Maui. And this time we had a third book, which was 1,400 pages. And now that meeting was about 300 people. When we did it again in 2004, it was in Puerto Rico. We had 400 people, but that now took off at the National Eye Institute. They started to realize, I should also note, and they started to change their plans about what was being funded. And they focused more on the front of the eye, which they hadn't really done in the past. I should also note, in the first conference that we had in 92, we'd invited Mike Lemp to give a talk about clinical trials in dry eye disease, and he was appalled at the lack of information that existed about 1, dry eye, and 2, clinical trials. So that prompted him with Tony Braun and Dan Nelson to launch the National Eye Institute Industry Workshop, and I was fortunate to be part of that as well. And so that resulted in Mike Lemp writing the report for that, but it all contributed. Before then, there was a man named Frank Hawley who had been at Schepens, went down to Texas. He'd had a meeting as well, I think in 82, about the front of the eye and published a book in this area. So the groups have been growing, the interest had been growing, but certainly but Klaus Dolman as well back then had already been pushing it with Mike Lemp, and a lot of the research came from Schepens and as well as some other locations. Juan Marube in Spain was a real driving force for this. He had a group out in Europe, and so it was just trying to build on what we had, but also to increase the awareness and always try to recruit people and to make sure that you also gave credit to people for helping. And so that's just how it built gradually. I should note that in 2000, we realized before that meeting we had in Maui that although we involved many people in the conferences and selections and the programs, at that particular point, I was primarily doing it myself. So this involved thousands of faxes and letters and mails and personally doing it. And I realized you just can't keep doing it this way. And so that prompted us in 2000 to launch the Tear Film and Ocular Surface Society to try to make it a non-profit organization to get more people involved. And so that was...
It's funny you mentioned back in 1992, and you mentioned the word disease associated with dry eye, which I know it was not really considered a disease at that point.
Syndrome.
Right?
Syndrome.
Right. Yeah, I know it's gone through several different definitions over the years, which TFOS played a big role in. But was there industry interest in any of this in the early days?
Initially, no. It was very hard to raise any funds at all for that first conference in 1992. I took a bath on that one. But whatever the case, one of the industries, Santen, for example, didn't send anybody because they thought it would be one of these, what they call these sort of clinical shows. Sorry to put it this way, but would they put people on a vote, give them a vote, give them a video, they'd watch something for 10 minutes, and the rest of the time, drink that California wine for the rest of the trip. And sort of not anything serious. So they had no idea what this was about. Later they learned, wow, this was a bigger meeting. So in 96, we did it again. Then they came. So that there was a little bit more funding for 96. It wasn't until 2000 that we were able to raise enough money to cover the entire conference. But so for industries, many letters written out to many of them, trying in many ways to convince them this was an important area, but there wasn't. I think back in 2000 when we had the meeting in Maui, we had Alcon as a title sponsor. I think it was Maui, or it could have been Bermuda for 96. Whatever the case, I know at the time Allergan was curious, well, why aren't we involved? Or it was Alcon. Allergan was going to be the sponsor. Sorry, I'm mixing these guys up. And Alcon, well, why aren't we really involved? And I said, well, if you want to be involved, step up. You can help support this, get involved. And so gradually, I think so many companies are hit up for meetings. They're looking for funding. They're looking for support. And the rationale is, what are we doing this for? I think once TFOS launched the first workshop for the dry eye workshop, the first one that we published in 2007, companies began to wake up. So, for example, a vice president of a very large company said that, they call it the Bible in Europe. The EMA calls it this for clinical trials and how to do them. I think after we published the next one and the next one on contact lens discomfort and Meibomian Gland dysfunction, those workshops, I think, even though they took 2 to 3 years each, really increased awareness. And as I think TFOS and our team, also again, recruiting Amy in 2001 to help grow this. And this is Amy Sullivan, my daughter, but she had just been working in a career in Boston in media relations. She had an IBM account and others, but she got hit with the .com disasters. And before she took off again over to Europe to learn yet another language, I said, please, can you help us for a while? So she had, actually, I should note that we had no benefits for her. She had no health coverage. She had a very tiny salary. And so she started out. And the governing board said, if she can do it, she can help raise funds, we'll keep her. And so the governing board decided to keep her because she was being effective. And so gradually, I transitioned the whole area of fundraising and this kind of stuff to Amy, who's then grown this even more in terms of social media. So I think with the awareness of TFOS, what it's accomplished and what it's published, and the impact that it's had, not only in terms of pharmaceutical companies and development or diagnostic companies, and also in terms of the ocular surface, now number 2 in the world in terms of eye care journals, it's become known. And so the outreach has grown, and so there's been a tremendous amount of interest. And I think when you go to ARVO, or you go to the optometry meetings, or you go to the ophthalmology meetings, there's just a far greater interest now from companies as well as, I think, clinicians as well as researchers in this whole area, which is still underserved.
It's amazing. When you look at your mission statement for TFOS, I think it says something like to increase research, education, and I love this word, literacy, in dry eye and ocular surface disease. And I would say success. Yeah, mission accomplished. But is it safe to, I think I heard you say that it started in 2000. So would this 2020 year, the meeting that was unfortunately canceled in Lake Como, that would have been the 20th anniversary of TFOS?
So TFOS, yeah, we applied for incorporation of the society in November 2000, and it was 2020. It was all set up for 2020. And so that was, we actually looked at that conference that was stopped and blocked because of COVID and just the situation today. That we thought would have been the best conference that we had had to date. But, and thank you, I think both of you are going to be involved with that, but it wasn't to be.
Well, if you go back just for a second, just so I tune into this, had you not really, what were the epiphanies along the way? When did it really strike you? Did you have some epiphany? I'll briefly share what made me care about dry eye. I went for a dry eye consultation, or a LASIK consultation down in Newport Beach with Tom Tuma. I was a 3-diopter spherical myope, and he said, you have higher order aberrations. He threw me on some steroids for a couple of weeks. I went back and they were gone. And dry eye was literally went from least to most important disease state in my practice when I recognized it's affecting my patient's vision. And that is why I'm sitting here today. I changed my entire practice. I made it a priority to look for dry eye. So something struck me as to why should eye doctors, essentially we're vision doctors, we want to give you best vision, and you've got to fix, if the tear film's not the right quality, we're not going to get that kind of vision we want our patients to have. And that's why I think doctors should care about it. But what struck you along the way? What were your epiphanies along the way that, there's really something here, and I can work on this body of work and do this research and get this to be understood better? Did you have that kind of epiphany?
I think it was a process in terms of just doing the research, being recruited into doing, and when I was recruited again to Boston at Schepens and Harvard Medical School, again, I had done research on pretty much every aspect of the body except the front of the eye. So again, my background was endocrinology and immunology and physiology in general. So we look at control systems and you say, all right, let's develop this. What if, to me, basic clinical epidemiologic research that we got involved with, most of interest to me is translational research. And so we started looking at the tear film. We started out with the lacrimal gland. Eventually, because of what we discovered in terms of the hormonal suppression of inflammation in the lacrimal gland and autoimmune diseases like Schepens, led to that being licensed by my institution to a company. And that company, we're going to continue those studies in lacrimal. They were going to do the Meibomian, but they never did it. I thought, whoa, the Meibomian is very important here as well. So we started doing work on the Meibomian gland as well as the other tissues in the eye. And we found, whoa, this is a huge area, because back when we started doing this, back in the 90s on the Meibomian gland, there were no studies at all in the physiological regulation of the tissue. Most of the research had been done with Jim McCulley, for example, down in Texas on various itis or inflammation, his classifications of the disease. A lot of research on cancer, a lot of research on animals and lipids, but that was it. In terms of the Meibomian gland, we didn't know. So we started doing a lot of research on that tissue. We realized, wow, this is really important. This tissue actually is perhaps the most important in terms of the dry eyes, which we learned to be the case, or so it seems today, as by far. And then the role of the tear film in the cornea, the conjunctiva, the health, and gradually this all grew. So as we made discoveries, and also we built upon, since a lot of the work, and we're not going to talk about that today, initially started out being the hormonal regulation of these glands, I went back and found in the literature studies from the 30s and 40s and 50s in other countries and other languages, had them translated and realized there are other people that realized about these sex differences in the eye and hormonal influence. And so you build upon those, you build upon what's known, and you make new discoveries, and you do it. And so with this, it continued to grow, and this helped hand in hand with TFOS. And a really important thing for TFOS, as Chris noted about the mission statement, in terms of the focus on the tear film and ocular surface, TFOS is all about the mission. And that mission statement, just to read it to you, which is to advance the research literacy and educational aspects of the scientific field of the tear film and ocular surface, is what we do. It's never about the individual. So there's no king here, there's no queen here, there's no individual. It's a collective effort. There are so many people involved in this throughout the world. And there have been from the beginning. It's just that there are a whole lot more. So that today, literally, we reach out to many hundreds of thousands of eye care practitioners through the network. But this growth has been over the years. And so, Chris, yes, 20 years. The 92 meeting was 8 years before it. But the launch of TFOS, just to try to handle the interest, began 20 years ago. And that's where we are today.
Yeah, it's amazing, actually, what you achieved, and I certainly would credit TFOS and the DEWS, the first TFOS DEWS report, as essentially creating the field as it is today. I mean, it's an exciting subspecialty of ophthalmology. I consider it a true subspecialty of ophthalmology, like retina or cornea or pediatrics or what have you, glaucoma. And I think the original is what got me, since we're telling personal stories about how we got into this. It was that original DEWS report that stimulated me. I read it cover to cover many times, and from that moment on, I've kind of been focusing on this and loving every minute of it. But I think also it helped to spur industry. And of course, you got to give Allergan some credit for getting Restasis approved, because I think that legitimized to some degree that this was a real condition with inflammation as the root, and we had an actual prescription medication that could actually help these patients. And so I think that those are the two kind of seminal moments, as it were, in this field of legitimizing it and growing it and getting people all over the world interested. And I think that the power of TFOS and the DEWS reports is that consensus, the worldwide consensus. I mean, there aren't many publications in any field that include that many people and reaching this consensus amongst experts And that's why it's such a credible document, and why everybody, whatever TFOS DEWS report says, definition, perfect example, is why it becomes the most cited publication in all of the field of all of ophthalmology, not just ocular surface. And why everybody, why we refer to it as the Bible. It might be sacrilegious to some, but it kind of is. And, it is every 10 years. Hopefully there will be another one in 10 years. It changes, changes the landscape. And it becomes the new normal, as it were.
And in the generation of these workshop reports, for example, which I think TFOS is best known for at this point, although it's been involved in so many other things, since I've organized all of them, the drama that has been associated with these reports has been extraordinary. And I think that
now we get to the good stuff.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that was one of my questions. I wasn't sure if you wanted to talk about that.
Because the eye community might be a bestseller in terms of that. I could go through some of this and the individuals and people, and what you do is sometimes the final common denominator default here in terms of trying to deal with these behind the scenes. So it's just like in a conference or a meeting. There are things that go amiss or awry, or oh my goodness, what happened, or what is happening, or what are they doing now? But you deal with it behind the scenes, so everything seems seamless. Like, oh, everything worked really well. So, I'd love to be able to share some of the stories with you, but I can't. We can't do that on this podcast.
We can't. Yeah, that's too bad. Yeah,
we could give examples, but I can't give people's names or things like that.
Oh, yeah. We'll take an example without a name. Give us an example, David. You don't have to name names.
Well, how about the stuff? There was a lot of, we'll call it controversy around the 2017 definition of dry eye disease, right? I mean, at the France TFOS meeting, months before the publication, there was a very different definition that was, some would say neutered, or just a much more broad definition that was proposed, and that fired up a lot of people. And of course, it was ultimately changed and tweaked and a little bit more detailed, a little bit longer of a definition, a little more specific, that brought in the neurological, the nerves, and the osmolarity and inflammation. But that raised a lot of blood pressure, people's blood pressures in the room. And so can you talk a little bit, without mentioning names, kind of that drama with the definition?
So sure, yeah, there was a lot associated with that. Perhaps I'll pick and choose a few things, but what we find in these workshops in general is that subcommittees vary tremendously. There are those that are very proactive, very active, and there are those that need some help and a boost, and there are those that you find some people have agendas that they want to promote for other reasons that may not be specifically what we see as the TFOS approach of evidence-based and open and transparent. And so sometimes what you need is some more input. So for the definition and classification subcommittee, this one, although people may have been doing the best that they could do, there were areas that the steering committee, and particularly the harmonization committee, believed that needed to be addressed. And I think it identified that there was perhaps a deficiency in the 2007 TFOS DEWS 2 definition. We went through all the various ones, and that rather than focusing on certain aspects as sort of like it's like how do you create a definition? And there were a number of aspects to that. So what happened after Montpellier is that from where we were at that point, another person was added as a co-chair of that subcommittee to help out, and there was a special meeting that was held at Dan Nelson's home in Minnesota, where we invited not only the members of that steering committee, or some of them, but also, or the chairs of that steering committee or subcommittee, but we also invited people who had been involved with, running the TFOS DEWS, which was Tony Braun, the vice chair of the Meibomian Gland Dysfunction workshop, which was Gary Fowkes. We invited other people who had a long-standing history in the area that could bring additional clinical views on this topic, as well as the research views. And that I was not there, nor was another person, because we were at other meetings overseas. And that group then worked and hashed out and put together some revisions and changes, which then went back to the subcommittee. And again, what we try to do is to get people all on board and try to agree and try to come up with a consensus. Is it ever 100% completely perfect? Probably not, but it's the best we can do. So here I think there was a goal we needed to relook and reevaluate. And as some said, we really shouldn't even have that TFOS DEWS 2 workshop until we have the definition, so that the group, for example, as you have done with an algorithm for the diagnosis, James Wolfson for the diagnostic subcommittee is like, how can we do a diagnosis of something that we don't yet have a definition for? So I'm not giving you a whole lot of information about that subcommittee. I guess I could do it over, a glass of Ornellaia, Scott, in Lake Como, as a Tuscan wine. But again, we always appreciate everything that anybody does in helping. And people, again, will do their best. We just realize sometimes that maybe there's more needed. It could be another subcommittee, for example, in Pickett, the Sex, Gender, and Hormone Subcommittee. Maybe we didn't have somebody who had a particular background. We needed to add them. So that's what we do.
Where did the original dry workshop idea come from? When did you decide to venture into these reports?
Originally, the idea came back, I think, in 2003, and Kazuo Sabota, who had been known since the mid-'80s, early 80s when he started out in that area, had said, it would be really good to have a meeting, a get-together of people to evaluate and reevaluate the diagnosis and maybe definition of dry eye disease. And I said, sure. And he actually brought that up. Amy was in a meeting in Japan, but she had asked Kazuo to attend the meeting with her. It was a fundraising meeting with Santen. But females in general, at least in this country, have a hard time going to Japan to raise funds and meetings with solely men in the room. At least that's the way it was back then. So she asked Kazuo to come to sit in as well. And on the train trip back from this meeting to Tokyo, Kazuo asked Amy, what would I think of a meeting to look at diagnosis? I thought it'd be a great idea. But I was in the midst of raising money for TFOS as well as raising money for the Puerto Rico conference. And I said, we can try to help you raise the funds. I can't be involved in the organization because I'm trying to do these other things as well. And so I suggested that he connect with Mike Lemp, who had been involved in the National Eye Institute Industry Workshop. And we suggested a number of other people, and it started. So that was the idea originally. But then what Kazuo realized or recognized, and what others, is that there were some difficulties and a lot of challenges in the organization of that particular workshop. So Kazuo then asked if TFOS would take it over. And we asked the board, and the board said yes. We asked Tony Braun if he'd chair it. He said yes. And the rest has gone on. And again, that one had also, for that one, we had a meeting in Miami after a lot of the work had been done. And this was in South Beach. Got all the people together like we do for these workshops, to have them all listen to presentations about where we were, what stage we were at. But we had to hire a mediator for that meeting. And his name was Chris Patterson, who was a past president of ARVO. Because the tensions were so high, the agendas of some people were so high, the agendas of certain companies were very high. They really wanted, there was one group that was dubbed the TFOS Mafia. I was not part of that group. They were really pushing to have the definition and things focus on a certain area. And we needed the mediator. There was a lot of testosterone patches on some of these people. And we had that meeting, and it was just different. And we ended up with TFOS DEWS report. It didn't end up the way certain companies wanted, but it didn't stop there, actually, for the TFOS reports. I remember for the Meibomian Gland Dysfunction workshop report being invited to lunch by, the vice president of another company, saying, could possibly change the definition just to add this word? And I remember saying right before lunch had served, no, we don't do it. We greatly appreciate industry support. Without it, we couldn't exist. but they don't have any editorial control. It's got to be evidence-based. It's got to be transparent. So for the original DEWS report, we had it. The original chapter on definition and classification is not what had been created by that subcommittee. That subcommittee actually needed to have a huge amount of information added to it. So there were certain people involved in adding tremendously to that definition and classification report from the original DEWS. And it was also decided at the Miami meeting not to have any authors on any of the subcommittee reports. It was decided just collectively, everybody would be an author of that entire report. And that's the way it came out. It comes out with no authors. And we changed it going forward.
Well, when you talk about definition, and you mentioned the trip to Japan, and Chris and I were talking about this earlier, you know, the Asian perspective on dry eye disease differs a lot from the Western world, correct? It's primarily based on a quick tear film breakup time. Is that right?
Correct. You know, in the meeting in 2013 in Taormina, we had a debate between Norihiko Yukoi. It was originally planned to be Mike Lemp and Norihiko about the short breakup time of the Japanese, and essentially, is it an artifact or not? And Norihiko, who had come up with this originally, or with his colleagues, but out of Kyoto with Shigeru Kinoshita, was arguing for. Mike Lemp couldn't go to the meeting. There was a problem, and so the night before he asked my son, actually, Benjamin Sullivan, to give the presentation for him. So Benjamin put together a presentation the night before.
You know, just as an aside, I was just telling Scott the same thing, that Mike, a couple of weeks before that meeting, I wasn't scheduled to go to the meeting, and Mike had called me and said, will you debate, you know, do this debate, you know, I can't go. And I looked at I wasn't going anyway, but I thought about getting on a plane and going. And then I looked at the arguments in the debate, and I thought, this is way above my pay grade. I do not, you know, I'm flattered that you think I might be able to pull this off, but, you know, it was just so kind of this esoteric area of breakup time and tears that I was like, I don't think I can do it justice. I'm not Mike Lemp, Mike, you know, but thank you for asking me. But I'm sure Ben did a great job.
So Ben, who was the inventor of Tear Lab and created that, had an extraordinary amount of data on his computer. So the night before, he put together, and again, subjective of a father, but a very cogent presentation. And just to be real, he crushed Norihiko. And Kazuo got up, and they voted for Ben as being winning, and short breakup time not being a factor. However, to realize the importance of short breakup time in Japan, and that is that from my perspective, and again, you can have any one of those people on one of these podcasts and ask otherwise. But years ago, Inspire Pharmaceutical tried to develop diclofosol, P2Y2 agonist, as a treatment for dry eye disease. And Ben Yerxa and his ideas and the people, they could never get a clinical trial repeated, nor could any other company until very recently for the treatment of dry eye. Allergan didn't either. But they couldn't get it approved. And they licensed the rights to Japan, though, to Santen. In the same way, Novartis had tried with the ribamapide, another agent. Both of these agents act by stimulating conjunctival fluid flow transiently and a little bit of mucus from the goblet cells. And this is what they do. And Novartis just bombed out with the ribamapide, but Japan picked that up. So Otsuka picked it up in Japan, and they then both focused on short breakup time. Because when you think about transient fluid flow, short period, and they excluded all the MGD patients. As we know now, the Meibomian Gland dysfunction patients contribute to or are the key people with dry eye. But they excluded that. And so Norihiko built up, and what they found was that if you then use DQuas, it's called from Santen, or Mucosta, it's called from Otsuka, for a short breakup time for a few seconds, which again in the 2013 meeting was artifact, but not in Japan, it was successful. So it could then, if you use that as a diagnostic indicator, you have those drugs approved by the Ministry of Japan. And actually the Ministry of Japan back in 2007 didn't have anybody in the eye, but TFOS was very involved in getting somebody in the Japanese ministry to focus on the eye. We were looking for funding and stuff. We didn't get it from Japan. But anyway, so it turns out a lot of the research in Japan and a lot of clinical research is funded by these companies. And so you're going to get funding from Santen, you're going to get funding from Yokosuka. It's going to help support, do studies on these. And if you focus on short breakup time, then they got approved. And Santen and Otsuka have done very, very well. I'll leave it to the clinicians to determine for themselves whether they believe this is effective or not. With those successes, Otsuka came back to the United States, went to another company in Washington to try to do, again, rabamipide in this country, but they failed. And it was Akisela. And so that didn't work again. So that for this country, they haven't been effective. They haven't. And so they are in Japan. I think they now have reached out to China. So the importance of a definition there by defining dry eye disease as a short breakup time also allows those particular compounds to be approved. And that's what's happened. Again, the clinicians there can comment on their experiences and whatever they've done with them. But that was a key factor. Inflammation, on the other hand, I have to credit Allergan. We were very involved way back when they had first, considered bringing from Rene Cazuan, who was a veterinarian who did dogs and using cyclosporin for the treatment of inflammation in dogs, had gone to Allergan to try to do this. And they'd done clinical trials with Sandoz for inflammation. This was back in the early 90s and late 80s. And I remember being called into Allergan to constructively critique cyclosporin. And I remember at the time, in the early 90s, the guy's name was Les Kaplan, who was the head of R&D, I guess, for Allergan. And I commented, based on everything that I'd seen that Rene had done, indicated that cyclosporin wasn't working through an anti-inflammatory mechanism. What it was most likely doing, because of the 30 days it took in dogs, that may or may not have had inflammation to begin with, was resetting the corneal receptors for the environment so that a change in it triggered a better response from the lacrimal gland after 30 days. And today, after talking to Carlos Belmonte and a number of other people, it's an editorial I always wanted to write, never got a time to do it. But it may be that cyclosporin actually works primarily by acting on the cornea and the corneal nerves. Inflammation, again, is an important factor downstream. But so far, for things like Meibomian gland dysfunction, there's no peer-reviewed evidence showing any inflammation in the Meibomian gland. So that, again, inflammation downstream is important. Allergan built up this whole area for inflammation and spent, as recent articles have come out in literature, over $600 million trying to educate clinicians that this is all about inflammation. And there's so much more we know about dry eye disease and so many other causes and things that are important. But to me, it's congratulations to Allergan, because they really made an effort to bring this increased awareness of this disease to clinicians around the world. And whatever the role of anti-inflammatories or not, or whatever stage, still Allergan played a huge role in this education.
Well, you mentioned the short tear film breakup time and osmolarity, and we're talking to Mark Wilcox soon down the road about the tear film report and reading through that. And Chris, I don't know if you know this, but in dry eye patients, you get osmolarity as the tear film thins and begins to fall apart to stimulate a blink. It can get up from 300 up to about 1800. It can go that high in the central cornea. Dry eye patients, it doesn't differ much from center to meniscus, but in non-dry eye patients, it doesn't differ much. In dry patients, it can differ tremendously in that hyperosmolarity triggering an inflammatory response, correct?
I think as the TFOS DEWS report concluded in the pathophysiology, was that, and this was not me, I came in later as part of the harmonization group to review it all. The final common denominator for dry eye disease is a concentrated tear film. It's hyperosmolar, and that triggers the corneal receptors, the cold-thermal receptors in the cornea to alleviate sensations of discomfort. It also promotes loss of goblet cells. It promotes breakup of the glycocalyx, which is critically important and increases evaporation. It also triggers the MAP kinase pathway, the NF-kappa B, the chemokines, the inflammation. Yes, it does all of that. So the hyperosmolarity stimulates that. If you bring that under control, you reduce that, those things go away. The pain will go away, as well as that inflammation is being triggered by it. It's very, very important, though, is that, as I think that Tier Lab has learned, the studies have learned in the literature, is that there are a number of patients who are misdiagnosed with dry eye disease, who may have allergy, for example. There were studies done 30 years ago on this. Misdiagnosed, or in this case, diagnosed with dry eye, but actually they have allergy or vice versa. There are people who are diagnosed with dry eye, but may have no change in osmolarity. The question is that actually dry eye? Maybe, maybe not. But I think that it's important then to distinguish those patients who have a higher osmolarity, that is then going to be dry eye disease. But if they don't have any change in their osmolarity, or if they have a PIFR, for example, then is it dry eye or is it something else? There have been articles that have been written about, well, dry eye patients don't have this or that. What we've learned over the years with this concentrated tear film is the importance of the left and the right eye measurements and the difference between those. And the more severe you get in dry eye disease, the higher the difference between the left and the right eye osmolarity grows, because you're trying to compensate. Each eye is different and it's being triggered. So yes, hyperosmolarity will drive inflammation on the front of the eye, and it can affect both the cornea and the conjunctiva.
And then after the original dry workshop, and by the way, Chris, that's what I did when I had this epiphany around 2011. I embraced the algorithm, and I found, oh my gosh, I've been underdiagnosing, undertreating for years, and finally put this expert consensus into place. And I think that's what doctors need to recognize. And I run a Facebook group called OS Docs, and there's ODs on Facebook, and people will ask a lot of times, you'll reach for autologous serum and amniotic membrane, and doctors need to understand, in my opinion, there is this expert consensus that looked at 150 ODs, MDs, and PhDs who took all this research, and one of the things that I think is important is they didn't just go to the conclusions, right? They looked at the validity of each. What was the N? What were the p-values? Were there financial considerations? They looked at the authenticity and was it retrospective or prospective? How meaningful was that data? And they came up with this, if you're type 2, we're going to match you a type 2 approach. It wasn't the stepwise approach, which DEWS 2 came up with, correct? It was more of a let's match severity with treatment. But I think that's what got me going, was being able to follow that expert consensus. And I've often been introduced at, when I speak about dry eye disease, being aggressive with dry eye, and I correct them every time. I'm not aggressive, I'm appropriate. I used to be under-treating my patients. Now I'm just following expert recommendations. So my message to clinicians is stop trying to create your own mom and pop thing. There's this consensus.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to join us next time as we continue our discussion with the brilliant Dr. David Sullivan. He's going to talk more about TFOS DEWS 2, how it came together, and we're also going to gain some insights into the MGD report of 2011. Thanks again.
Thanks for listening. Join us for our next episode soon. Find us online at www.ocularsurfaceacademy.com, all major podcast platforms, and YouTube.
Lacrimetics, providing proven dry eye disease treatment options since 1984. Contact us now.